This photograph was taken in the final weeks of World War II. But exactly when and where in a Europe already collapsing into ash? Who stood behind the camera as the flames consumed this wooden building? A war correspondent, a soldier, or someone who never expected to witness this moment at all? Look closely at the woman reaching toward the lens. Why is terror written so clearly across her face? What is she begging for? Rescue or mercy? Behind her, other women collapse to their knees, covering their faces as if they cannot bear to see what is coming next. And then there is the man in uniform. Is he the threat they fear, or the only reason they will survive? Why, in a burning building, would anyone scream louder at the sight of approaching soldiers than at the fire itself? This image captures a moment when death was certain, but rescue was something far more terrifying. And the truth behind it is not what they were taught to believe. April 19th, 1945. A forest in Bavaria, Germany. The fire came fast, fed by weeks of dry wind and the brittle floor of early spring. It ran through the undergrowth like an animal that had learned where to bite. Pine needles crackled, sap hissed. Smoke climbed the trunks and flattened against the low sky, turning daylight the color of rust. The building at the center of it was nothing more than wood and habit, planks nailed together in a hurry, meant to last a season, not a war. 31 German women were inside when the first wall of flame reached the trees behind it. Some were nurses, some clerks. Some had never held a weapon. All of them had been running for days, sleeping where they could, believing the forest itself might hide them from what was coming. The heat pressed in before the fire arrived. It pushed against skin and lungs, heavy and close. Smoke leaked through the seams in the walls and pooled near the ceiling, then sank. The women coughed and wrapped scarves around their mouths. Someone shouted for water, but there was none. Someone else began to pray, the words tumbling over one another, unfinished. Outside, branches fell with sharp cracks that sounded like rifle fire. The roof began to creak. Sparks slipped through the cracks and skittered across the floor. The building had become a box. They knew what fire did. They could smell it. They could hear it. They could feel it, searching for a way in. And then, through the smoke, they heard boots. Not the frantic pounding of their own feet, not the blind running of animals fleeing flame. These were steady, heavy steps, coming toward them, not away. Shouts followed, short, clipped, unfamiliar. English. When the women realized what they were hearing, something inside them broke loose. They screamed, not in relief, not in hope, in terror. Several rushed toward the back wall where the flames were already licking up the boards, choosing heat over hands they had been taught to fear. One woman clawed at a window frame until her palms bled, trying to widen it enough to crawl through, even as smoke poured in. Another collapsed to her knees, shaking so violently she could not stand. Someone shouted, "Amerikaner!" as if it were a warning, as if naming the danger might hold it back. A few of the women reached into their pockets with practiced speed. Small capsules appeared in trembling fingers, cyanide, issued months earlier with quiet instructions that had been repeated often enough to become instinct. Better to die quickly, better to choose the moment, better than capture. The fire roared closer. The door burst inward with a sound like splitting bone. 3 figures filled the doorway, half silhouetted by flame. Their helmets were dark with soot. Wet cloths were tied over their mouths and noses. Rifles hung forgotten at their sides as they scanned the room, eyes moving fast, taking in the smoke, the heat, the huddled bodies. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. The women stared at the men as if at something unreal. The men stared back, frozen by the sight of faces turned toward them in absolute, unfiltered fear. Then the screaming returned, louder, sharper. One woman tried to run past them and nearly fell into the fire outside. Another sobbed and shouted words that came out tangled and broken, half German, half English, pleading for something she did not quite dare to name. The Americans raised their hands, palms open, voices cutting through the chaos. "Hey, hey, no, stop! Fire, you gotta move, now!" The women did not understand the words. They understood the uniforms. For 12 years they had been told what those uniforms meant. They had been told that American soldiers were monsters, undisciplined, brutal, driven by cruelty and revenge. They had been told that surrender was a lie, that capture led only to humiliation and pain. They had been told that death was preferable, that honor required it. So when the enemy finally stood in front of them, framed by fire, the women recoiled. One of the Americans stepped forward anyway. He reached for the nearest woman, a nurse whose hair was streaked gray with ash. She flinched so hard she nearly fell, eyes wide, breath coming in shallow gasps. His hand paused in midair, then closed gently around her arm, firm enough to guide, careful enough not to hurt. "Nobody's killing anybody," he said, though she could not understand him. "We're getting out. Now." Behind him, another soldier bent and lifted a woman who had collapsed, smoke and fear having stolen her strength. He carried her as if she weighed nothing, one arm under her knees, the other around her back, his shoulders already blistering from the heat. Outside, the fire leapt and snapped, impatient. The forest burned with the steady certainty of something doing exactly what it was made to do. The women stumbled toward the door, coughing, crying, clutching at one another. Some looked back at the flames as if still weighing their options. Others looked only at the Americans, searching their faces for the violence they had been promised. It was not there. By April of 1945, the United States Army had crossed the Rhine and pushed deep into the heart of Germany. The war for America was nearly won. Its soldiers were seasoned, disciplined, and exhausted. They had seen cities flattened and friends buried. They had learned how quickly victory could turn into something ugly if it was not held in check. In that burning building, at the edge of a collapsing Reich, America stood at the height of its power. And 31 German women were more afraid of being saved by it than of dying in the fire. Why? What kind of country terrifies its enemies not through cruelty, but simply by existing? The answer did not begin with the flames. It began years earlier, in classrooms and radios and whispered warnings, in a fear carefully built and carefully maintained. And it would take more than a rescue to tear it apart. The fear that filled the burning building did not begin with the fire. It began years earlier, long before uniforms or smoke or shouted commands in a foreign language. It began in classrooms where maps were rolled down and portraits hung on the wall, watching silently as children learned which lives mattered and which did not. It began in radios that crackled every evening with voices that spoke slowly and confidently, explaining the world in simple terms that left no room for doubt. Most of the women in that forest had grown up inside that world. They had been girls when the Reich was young. They learned to read from textbooks that told them Germany had been humiliated, cheated, surrounded by enemies who envied its strength. They sang songs about sacrifice before they understood what sacrifice required. Teachers repeated what the state had already decided was true. To question was not courage. To question was weakness. Posters followed them everywhere, in train stations, in post offices, outside cinemas. Americans were drawn with distorted faces and slouched bodies greedy mouths open, eyes empty. They were shown as undisciplined and cruel, men without honor who relied on machines because they lacked character. British soldiers were decadent. Russians were animals. And Americans were the worst of all. A nation without roots. A people without culture. Dangerous precisely because they smiled while they destroyed. The message never changed, only its volume. By the time war came, it was everywhere. Loudspeakers in town squares, newsreels before films, mandatory lectures before assignments. The women who would later become nurses and clerks and radio operators absorbed it the same way they absorbed everything else, because there was no alternative. No second voice to weigh against the first. No safe place to ask whether any of it might be untrue. They were taught that capture was not an end, but a beginning of suffering. In lectures delivered by men in pressed uniforms, they were warned about what awaited them if they fell into enemy hands. Americans, they were told, did not respect women. They humiliated prisoners for sport. They tortured without reason. They killed without necessity. To surrender was to lose not only freedom, but dignity, identity, humanity itself. Death in that calculus was mercy. So cyanide capsules were issued quietly, almost tenderly, as if the state were offering its daughters one last kindness. Instructions were brief. If capture was imminent, use it. Do not hesitate. Do not allow yourself to be taken. The women memorized those instructions without emotion. It was simply another duty. Most of them were not fanatics. That was a lie that would come later, when the war was over and blame needed somewhere to settle. They were ordinary young women shaped by an extraordinary system. Some volunteered for service because it offered food, or training, or escape from a village that had grown too small. Some were assigned because the war needed hands wherever it could find them. They became nurses, tending wounded men whose blood soaked through bandages faster than they could be changed. They became radio operators hunched over crackling sets, passing coordinates and weather reports they barely understood. They became clerks, filing names that would later appear on lists no one wanted to read. They were not taught to kill. They were taught to obey. And obedience in a total state does not feel like a choice. It feels like gravity. The fear followed them everywhere. Even when the front lines collapsed and retreat became a constant movement westward, the stories traveled faster than the armies. Whispers moved through barracks and hospital tents. Someone had heard what the Americans did in Italy. Someone else knew a woman who had been captured in France and never returned. No details were ever clear. They did not need to be. Fear does not require precision. By the spring of 1945, Germany itself had begun to disappear. Cities burned, roads clogged with refugees. Hospitals overflowed with men too young or too old to have been sent to fight. The Reich that had promised order delivered chaos instead. But the propaganda did not change. If anything, it hardened. The closer defeat came, the more necessary the lie became. Americans were no longer just enemies. They were the embodiment of everything Germany was told it must not become. To fall into their hands was to fall out of history itself. So, when the women fled into the forest, carrying what little they could, they were not only running from artillery and advancing troops. They were running from an image that had been carved into them over more than a decade. They had never seen Americans. Not really. They had seen drawings, heard voices, watched carefully edited films. But no one had ever described an American soldier helping a stranger to her feet. No one had ever shown an American medic bandaging an enemy's wound. Without comment. Those images did not exist because they would have shattered the story. And the story was everything. Fear in that system was not an accident. It was a tool. It kept people in line. It made questions dangerous. It made mercy suspicious. It taught an entire generation to equate humanity with weakness and cruelty with strength. That was why the women screamed when the door burst open. They were not reacting to individual men. They were reacting to an idea that had been repeated so often it felt like memory. In their minds, capture did not mean survival. It meant erasure. Being touched by the enemy meant becoming something less than human. Better to burn. Better to choose the fire, which at least made sense. The tragedy was not that they believed these things. The tragedy was how completely they believed them. For 12 years, fear had been layered carefully on top of fear, reinforced by ritual and authority and silence. By the time American boots appeared in the smoke, the fear no longer needed instruction. It lived inside them, automatic and absolute. That is the power of a system that weaponizes terror. It does not need to threaten. It teaches people to do that work themselves. From the outside, it would later be easy to ask why they did not see the truth sooner, why they did not resist, why they did not question what they were told. But fear does not announce itself as fear. It announces itself as reality. And on April 19, 1945, in a burning building in Bavaria, 31 women acted exactly as they had been trained to act. They fled from mercy. They chose flames over hands held out to help them. Only later would they begin to understand how carefully that choice had been taught, and how fragile the lie would prove once it was finally exposed to the light. The Americans did not rush in shouting. They did not fire into the air to force obedience. They did not bark orders the way the women had been taught enemies always did. The fire was loud enough on its own. It roared and snapped and consumed the forest with mechanical certainty. Against that sound, the soldiers' movements were almost quiet. One of them tore strips from a blanket and soaked them in water from a canteen, passing the cloth from hand to hand without a word. Faces were covered quickly, efficiently. Another soldier kicked aside burning debris near the doorway with his boot, clearing a narrow path just wide enough for a person to pass. Smoke curled around their helmets and clung to their uniforms. The heat pressed against them, but none of them hesitated. Inside the building, panic had turned the air into something solid. Women stumbled into one another, disoriented, choking, blind with fear and smoke. A nurse collapsed near the wall, her knees buckling as if her body had decided before her mind that it could not go on. Without ceremony, one of the Americans bent and lifted her. He did not ask her name. He did not check her uniform. He simply adjusted his grip and carried her toward the door. "The whole damn place is on fire," another voice said, firm but not raised. "We need to move. Now." The words meant nothing to the women. The tone meant everything. There was urgency in it, but not cruelty. Command, but not menace. It was the voice of someone trying to get people out of danger, not push them into it. One woman tried again to pull away, eyes wild, convinced that the hands on her arms were leading her somewhere worse. She fought weakly, nails scraping at wool. The soldier holding her did not tighten his grip in anger. He shifted, placing himself between her and the flames, guiding her forward step by step as if she were unsteady, not defiant. Another American moved deeper into the room, scanning the floor through the smoke. He crouched, found a second woman lying near the back wall, and slung her arm over his shoulder. Her head lolled against his chest as he lifted her, her breath shallow but steady. He turned without a word and carried her out into the firelit clearing beyond the door. Outside, sparks drifted down like snow. The forest was chaos, trees burning from the ground up, branches collapsing in showers of embers. The night sky glowed orange and red, the fire reflecting off the low clouds so that it seemed as if the world itself were burning. Somewhere to the east, artillery thudded faintly, distant and indifferent. The Americans moved through it with grim focus. They made trips back into the building again and again, each time emerging with another woman, coughing, crying, barely conscious. Smoke blackened their hands and streaked their faces. Their eyes burned. Their lungs screamed. Still they went back. No one counted. No one asked how many were left. They simply kept moving until there were no more voices inside calling out, no more shapes crumpled against the walls. At some point, one of the women found her voice. "Don't leave us here," she cried, the words breaking apart as they left her mouth. Her English was clumsy, learned years earlier in school, never meant to be used like this. She reached out toward the soldiers as they turned back toward the fire, panic surging at the thought of being abandoned again, this time to the flames. The soldier nearest her stopped. He turned and looked at her. Really looked, as if seeing her for the first time beyond the smoke and fear. For a moment, his expression shifted, something like surprise crossing his face. Then he shook his head. "Hey," he said softly, though she could not understand him. "No, we got you." He went back into the fire. When the last woman was out, the building was already lost. Flames burst through the roof and collapsed it inward, sending a column of sparks into the sky. The Americans pulled back, herding the women farther into the clearing, away from falling debris and creeping fire. They moved with the same care they might have used evacuating civilians, from a burning home back in Ohio or Iowa or Kansas. That was the truth of it. Most of them had been civilians not long before. Farmers, mechanics, students, men who had known what it was to rush toward danger because someone else needed help. The uniform had not erased that instinct. It had not replaced it with hatred. They did not see enemies. They saw people about to die. As the women collapsed onto the damp ground, coughing and retching, one of the soldiers passed around his remaining water. He tipped the canteen carefully, letting each woman sip just enough not to choke. Another shrugged off his jacket and draped it over the shoulders of a nurse who was shaking uncontrollably. Whether from smoke or shock, he could not tell. No one lectured. No one scolded. No one celebrated. They worked. The women watched them with a confusion deeper than fear. This was not how it was supposed to happen. There was no beating, no shouting, no laughter at their terror. The men did not look triumphant. They looked tired, focused, concerned. One woman began to cry, not the sharp, panicked sobbing of moments earlier, but something quieter, heavier. Another followed. Soon, several were weeping openly, faces buried in their hands, the weight of what had almost happened crashing down on them all at once. One of the Americans stood nearby, uncertain what to do with that kind of grief. He shifted his weight, glanced toward his sergeant, then back at the women. Finally, awkwardly, he crouched and set a hand on the ground near one woman's knee, not touching her, just close enough to be felt. It was enough. For the first time since the fire began, the women began to understand what had happened. The enemy had not come to finish them. The enemy had come to save them. That realization did not bring immediate relief. It brought something more unsettling. Everything they had been taught about Americans, about what power looked like, about how victory expressed itself, was suddenly wrong. The strongest men they had ever encountered had not used that strength to dominate them. They had used it to carry them out of a burning building. Somewhere deep in the forest, the fire continued its work. Trees fell. The ground smoldered. The war rumbled on, indifferent to small human moments like this one. But in that clearing, On that night, a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. For the first time, the women could not reconcile what they had been told with what they had just lived through. The image of the American as monster cracked, not from argument or evidence, but from touch, hands lifting, voices urging, bodies placed between them and the flames. Years later, people would ask how beliefs collapse so suddenly, how a lifetime of fear can be undone in minutes. The answer was there, written in soot and smoke. No speeches, no slogans, no declarations of moral superiority, just men running into fire because that was what needed to be done. That was who they were. The fire was left behind in the forest, still burning, still devouring what it could. The women were led away from it in small groups, coughing, heads down, clothes streaked with ash. An American truck waited on a dirt road beyond the trees, its engine idling, headlights dimmed. The women braced themselves for what usually came next. They expected to be shoved. They expected rifles in their backs, shouted orders they would not understand, hands that pushed too hard and too fast. They had prepared themselves for that humiliation. It fit the story they knew. Instead, an American soldier stepped up to the tailgate and held out his hand. One by one, the women were helped up into the truck. Not thrown, not hurried, helped. The soldier steadied each of them as they climbed, his grip firm, almost careful, as if he were afraid of causing pain. When one woman stumbled, another soldier caught her elbow before she could fall. No one laughed, no one commented. The truck bed filled with quiet bodies pressed close together, the women holding on to the wooden sides as if the ground might give way beneath them again. The Americans climbed in last, standing at the edges making space. When the truck lurched forward, one soldier shifted his stance to block a woman from being thrown against the side. The road stretched on through the dark. No one spoke. The women waited for the moment when kindness would turn. It had to turn. Everything they had learned insisted on it. Mercy was always temporary. It existed only to make cruelty sharper when it finally arrived. But the truck kept moving. It arrived at a facility outside a small town whose name meant nothing to them. Barbed wire marked the perimeter, but it did not feel like a trap. It felt organized. Lights glowed steadily. Tents stood in rows. American flags hung from poles, barely stirring in the night air. The women were helped down from the truck the same way they had been helped up. Inside a concrete building, steam drifted through an open doorway. The women froze when they were directed toward it. Showers. The word carried weight they could not put into language. Stories from the East came rushing back. Stories about what happened to women in places where hot water meant something else entirely. Some of them began to cry again, quietly this time. Others stared straight ahead, faces blank, preparing themselves. A female American officer stood near the door. Her uniform was pressed. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm. "Take your time," she said, slowly, as if speaking to frightened children. "You're safe here." Inside, there was only water. Real water. Hot, steady streams pouring from metal heads mounted along the walls. Steam filled the room, softening the harsh edges of the concrete. Bars of soap waited on narrow shelves. Clean towels were stacked neatly near the door, white and thick. The women stood there, unmoving, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with what they believed. One of them reached out and placed her hand under the water. She flinched at first, expecting pain. Instead, heat spread across her skin, deep and soothing. She let out a sound she did not recognize as her own and stepped fully beneath the stream. Others followed. Dirt and smoke and dried blood ran down their bodies and disappeared into the drain. Some stood rigid, eyes open, afraid the water might stop if they relaxed. Others tilted their faces upward and closed their eyes, letting the heat run over them as if trying to wash away more than soot. No one rushed them. No one counted the minutes. When they were finished, clean clothes waited. Simple dresses, undergarments, socks. Nothing marked with stripes or numbers. Nothing that said prisoner. Just clothes, plain, serviceable, human. Combs lay beside small mirrors, the kind that caught the light and reflected faces the women barely recognized anymore. They dressed in silence. Beds waited next. Real beds, with cots that did not creak and blankets that carried the faint smell of wool and soap. The women sat on the edges of them, unsure whether to lie down, unsure whether permission was required for something so ordinary. Eventually, exhaustion decided for them. One by one, they stretched out, hands resting on their chest, staring at the canvas ceilings above. Sleep came in fragments. Morning brought food. The mess hall was long and open, sunlight cutting across wooden tables. Trays slid along a counter, stopping beneath hands that served without ceremony. Bread, soft, white, canned beef with gravy, vegetables that were not spoiled, coffee with sugar. The women stared at their plates. Some waited, convinced it was a test. Others lifted their forks with shaking hands and took small bites, as if too much at once might break the spell. The taste of fat and salt spread across tongues that had known little but scarcity for months. This was not a feast prepared for effect. This was a standard ration. By American records, it amounted to roughly 2,800 calories a day. More than most German civilians were receiving. More than many German soldiers had seen in years. The realization settled heavily among the tables. As they ate, the women thought of home, of mothers stretching thin soups, of children with hollow faces, of towns where the smell of food had vanished entirely. Germany was starving. The Reich that had promised abundance delivered hunger instead. America was not. No one explained this difference. No one pointed it out. The Americans simply ate their own meals nearby, the same food, from the same trays, without comment. There was no sense of performance. This was not generosity staged for witnesses. This was routine. That was what made it unbearable. If the enemy could feed its prisoners this way, if it could offer hot water and clean clothes and enough food to make tears spill onto a wooden table, then something fundamental was wrong with the story the women had lived by. They began to ask questions they did not dare speak aloud. If Americans were monsters, why did they bother with towels? If capture was worse than death, why did it feel like survival? If this was how the enemy treated defeated women, then what did that say about the nation they had served? The cruelty they had expected would have been easier to understand. Pain would have confirmed everything. Violence would have allowed them to remain afraid, remain certain. Kindness offered no such shelter. It forced comparison. It forced memory. It forced doubt. In the days that followed, the small shocks continued. Burns were treated carefully by medics who spoke gently and worked with practiced hands. Blankets were replaced when nights turned cold. Guards passed by without insults, without threats, sometimes offering awkward nods that carried no meaning the women could grasp. Each gesture was minor on its own. Together, they were devastating. The women had been prepared to endure cruelty. They had trained themselves for it. They had been taught how to survive it. They had not been taught how to survive mercy. At night, lying awake on clean sheets, they stared into the dark and felt the ground shifting beneath them. If this was America, if this quiet competence, this unremarkable humanity was real, Then the certainty that had carried them through the war began to crumble. "If they do this for us," one woman whispered in the dark, barely moving her lips, "then what are we fighting for?" No one answered. There was no answer that did not frighten them. The fire in the forest had burned away wood and leaves and the last illusions of safety. What followed burned more slowly, more deeply. It consumed the stories they had relied on, the ones that had explained the world and their place in it. This was the point of no return. They had crossed from fear into something worse. They had crossed into doubt. And doubt, once allowed to take hold, would not stop until everything else had been reduced to ash. The change did not arrive all at once. It came quietly, in moments so small they seemed almost accidental, accumulating day by day until the weight of them became impossible to ignore. A medic arrived one morning with a tray of supplies and a tired smile. He knelt beside a woman whose forearm had blistered badly in the fire, his movements careful, practiced. He cleaned the wound slowly, as if time were something he could afford to waste. His hands did not shake. He did not rush. When she flinched, he paused and waited for her breathing to steady before continuing. When he finished, he wrapped the bandage neatly and looked up at her face. "You're going to be fine," he said, though she did not understand the words. His tone carried the meaning well enough. Before he stood, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded photograph, edges worn soft. He held it out, pointing first at the image, then at himself. A woman stood in the picture, smiling, a baby balanced on her hip. The medic tapped the baby's face and smiled again, broader this time, pride unmistakable. "My son," he said. The German woman stared at the photograph as if it were contraband. Enemy soldiers were not supposed to have families. They were not supposed to miss anyone. They were not supposed to carry small reminders of love into places like this. When the medic tucked the photograph away and moved on, something remained behind, heavier than the bandage on her arm. Others experienced similar moments. A guard stopped during an afternoon check and asked, in halting German, whether anyone needed more blankets. Another soldier tried to teach a group of women English words while they waited in line. Simple ones, spoken slowly and repeated with patient smiles. "Hello. Thank you. Please." The women answered quietly, testing the unfamiliar sounds in their mouths. The exchange felt absurd, surreal, as if two incompatible worlds were overlapping by mistake. Then there was the music. One evening, an American soldier brought a record player into the compound. He set it on a table near the tents and cranked the handle until it whirred to life. When the needle touched the vinyl, sound spilled out, bright, swinging, unrestrained. Jazz. It was unlike anything the women had known. The rhythm skipped and bent, refusing to march in straight lines. It laughed at structure. It invited movement without demanding obedience. A few American soldiers began to dance, clumsy and exaggerated, making fools of themselves on purpose. The women watched, stiff at first, arms crossed, eyes wary. Then one of them smiled. It slipped out before she could stop it, quick and unguarded. Another laughed softly, surprised by the sound of her own voice. Soon, a few were tapping their feet, then swaying, then standing. An American corporal extended a hand, unsure, toward one woman. She hesitated only a second before taking it. They moved awkwardly together, out of step, laughing when they collided instead of apologizing. Others followed. For the first time in years, the women heard laughter that did not belong to propaganda films or nervous hysteria. It was light, ordinary, human. That night, lying in their bunks, they stared at the canvas above them, and tried to reconcile the joy they had felt with the hatred they had been taught. The contradiction grew sharper days later when the announcement came. The women were gathered in the open yard, standing in loose lines. An American officer spoke through a translator. His voice was formal, restrained. Adolf Hitler was dead. For a moment, no one reacted. The words floated in the air, strange and weightless, as if they did not belong to the same world as the women hearing them. Hitler had always been present, on walls, in speeches, in classrooms. He had been the fixed point around which everything else revolved. Now he was gone. Germany would surrender within days. The women stood in silence. Some felt nothing at all. Others felt something fracture inside their chests, a soundless break that left them hollow. The Reich that had promised eternity had lasted barely more than a decade. The future they had been told to believe in dissolved in a sentence. If the leader was gone, if the war was lost, then what had all of this meant? The answer arrived soon after, and it was far more brutal than defeat. A week after the surrender, the prisoners were ordered into a large tent. A white sheet hung at one end. A projector sat on a table beneath it. The women recognized the setup immediately and braced themselves for more propaganda, more lectures from the victors. The American commander addressed them briefly. "We want you to see something," he said through the translator. "You need to understand what your government did." The lights dimmed. The film began without music. Images flickered across the sheet. Barracks crowded with bodies too thin to be alive, faces with eyes too large for their skulls, piles of corpses stacked like firewood, crematoria, gas chambers disguised as showers. The women watched. Some turned away almost immediately, hands flying to their mouths. Others stared, frozen, as if looking harder might make the images change. A few collapsed to the ground, retching, sobbing, unable to remain upright. Numbers appeared on the screen. Millions dead, Jews, Roma, political prisoners, the disabled, people marked for removal by categories the women recognized, categories they had seen in textbooks and lectures, stripped of meaning until now. The Americans did not stop the film when the women cried. They did not soften it. They let it run to the end. When the lights came back on, the tent was silent in a way that felt final. This was not enemy propaganda. It was not exaggeration. It was documentation. The lie did not belong to the enemy. It belonged to the nation they had served. The women did not speak as they returned to their tents. That night, sleep did not come. The images returned again and again, relentless. They thought of the lectures that had warned them about Allied lies. They thought of the whispers they had ignored during the war, rumors they had chosen not to pursue because asking questions had felt dangerous. They had told themselves they were just nurses, just clerks, just radio operators. They had told themselves they were not responsible. Now those words sounded thin. One woman sat at a small table and opened a notebook she had been given earlier in the week. She stared at the blank page for a long time before writing. "They pulled us from the fire. They fed us. They treated our wounds. And now they show us this. They are not what we were told, but we were exactly what they said we were." The realization was crushing. The women had expected to be victims. They had prepared for suffering at the hands of an enemy. Instead, they were forced to confront a far more uncomfortable truth, that they had lived inside a system that demanded obedience at the cost of humanity, and that they had complied. Not because they were evil, but because fear had made obedience feel necessary. The Americans did not press them for confessions. They did not demand apologies. They did not force statements or oaths. They let the women sit with what they had seen, let the weight of it settle where it would. That restraint mattered. It made denial impossible. In the days that followed, the women began to understand their rescue in a new way. The fire in the forest had not only spared their lives, it had stripped away the last protection their beliefs had offered them. They had been saved by people they were taught to hate, and those people, without speeches or slogans, had shown them something their own nation never had: the difference between power used to dominate and power used to preserve life. America did not need to convince them of anything. The truth had done the work on its own. The women would carry that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. Some would speak of it openly. Others would bury it deep, too heavy to share. But none of them would ever forget the moment when the enemy became human, and the familiar became monstrous. They had crossed a line deeper than captivity. They had become witnesses, and once seen, the truth could not be unseen. The American trucks moved slowly across roads that barely deserved the name. Bridges lay twisted in riverbeds. Rail lines ended abruptly in fields of shattered stone. Entire towns had collapsed into themselves, reduced to uneven piles of brick and timber that still smoked faintly when rain fell. From the back of the truck, the women watched the country they had served slide past in fragments. Cities were gone. Not damaged, gone. Streets they remembered had vanished beneath rubble. Church towers leaned at broken angles. Factories stood open to the sky, their roofs torn away, their machines silent and rusting. The air smelled of dust, wet stone, and something sour that lingered too long to be ignored. People crowded the roads. Women pulled carts piled with salvaged wood and broken furniture. Old men shuffled beside bicycles with no tires. Children stared without curiosity, eyes dull from hunger and shock. Everyone was thin. Everyone moved as if conserving what little strength remained. Food was scarce. The women learned this quickly. In the American camp, they had eaten until their hands stopped shaking. Back home, a loaf of bread became an argument. Soup was watered down until it barely carried a smell. Official rations, when they arrived at all, amounted to less than 1,000 calories a day. People argued over scraps. People disappeared. When the women reached their hometowns, or what remained of them, they were not welcomed as survivors. They were greeted with suspicion. You were prisoners. "Why?" neighbor asked, eyes narrowing as she took in a woman's relatively healthy face, her clean clothes. "You don't look like you suffered." The accusation sat plainly in the words. "While the cities burned, you were safe. While we starved, you were fed." The women tried to explain. They spoke carefully at first, then more urgently. They talked about the fire, about being pulled out by American soldiers, about hot water and bandages and food served without cruelty. They spoke about what they had seen in the camps on film, about the truth that had been hidden from them for years. Most people did not want to hear it. "That's Allied propaganda," someone said sharply. "They want you to believe that." Another shook her head. "Of course they treated you well. They want to look good. They destroyed our cities." The women learned to recognize the moment when it was better to stop speaking. Eyes hardened. Faces closed. The truth they carried made people uncomfortable. It suggested responsibility. It suggested complicity. It threatened the last thing many still clung to, the belief that they had been deceived, but not involved. Silence was easier. Some of the women found their homes occupied by strangers, refugees from the East, families with nowhere else to go. Others found only empty foundations where houses had stood. A few reunited with parents who looked at them with a mix of relief and resentment, unable to reconcile gratitude with jealousy. "You were fed," one mother said quietly, not looking at her daughter. "We were not." No answer could bridge that gap. At night, the women lay awake in cellars or barns, listening to the sounds of a country trying to survive itself. They thought of the American camp, not with longing, but with confusion. The memory refused to fit with the ruins around them. In America, they had been prisoners, and yet treated as human beings. In Germany, they were free, and yet judged. The contrast cut deeper than hunger. They did not speak of America often anymore. When they did, it was cautiously, choosing words that sounded less like praise. They learned that admiration for the former enemy was interpreted as betrayal. It was easier to let people believe what they already believed. Years passed. Germany rebuilt slowly, unevenly. Aid arrived. Factories restarted. Streets were cleared. A new generation grew up among scaffolding and silence, taught again, this time to look forward, not back. The women carried their memories quietly. Across the ocean, America moved on too. Its factories that had once produced bombers and trucks shifted to cars and appliances. The men who had run into fire returned home, took off their uniforms and went back to work. They raised families. They rarely spoke about what they had done overseas, because to them it had not felt extraordinary. It had felt necessary. The women understood that now. They understood that what had shocked them most was not American strength, but American normalcy. The rescue had not been framed as mercy. It had been framed as obligation. The simple act of helping people in danger because that was what decent people did. That understanding followed them through the decades. When news from America reached them, of prosperity, of industry, of confidence, it carried a different weight. They remembered a nation that had been united enough to feed both its soldiers and its prisoners. A nation that had believed rules mattered even when victory was certain. They also watched from a distance as the world changed. Arguments grew louder. Trust thinned. The certainty that had once driven both nations toward catastrophe reappeared in new forms, wearing different uniforms. The women did not comment on these things publicly. They had learned how easily certainty could become dangerous. But privately, they compared. They compared the America that had pulled them from a burning building to the America they now saw struggling with itself. They compared the discipline of restraint to the noise of division. They compared a time when power had been paired with responsibility to a world that often mistook volume for strength. They did not say that one era was better. They did not need to. The contrast spoke on its own. For the women, the truth they carried never became easier. It remained awkward, unwelcome, resistant to neat conclusions. They had seen kindness where they were told there would be cruelty. They had found humanity in the hands of the enemy and denial among their own. History would record dates and treaties. It would chart reconstruction and alliances. It would measure success in currencies and borders. What it would not easily record was this quieter reckoning, the one that followed them home, that reshaped how they understood loyalty, obedience, and responsibility. They had returned to Germany with more than survival. They had returned with a comparison, and once made, it could never be undone. Time moved on, whether the women were ready for it or not. 30 years passed. Germany changed its face. Rubble became buildings. Silence gave way to traffic and conversation. The children born after the war grew up without air raid sirens in their memories, without ration cards folded in their pockets. The women aged quietly alongside the country, carrying their past the way one carries an old injury, no longer bleeding, but never entirely gone. 50 years passed. Hair turned gray. Hands stiffened. The war began to feel distant, even to those who had lived it. Television documentaries replaced first-hand stories. Dates and numbers stood in for experience. Some of the women spoke rarely about their captivity. Others spoke only within their families, late at night, voices lowered not out of fear but habit. 70 years passed. Graves filled with names that once belonged to young women running through smoke. The forest in Bavaria grew back. No marker remained where the building had stood. If you walked there now, you would see only trees and leaves and sunlight breaking through branches. But the rescue endured. The women went on with their lives. Some became nurses again, tending wounds in peacetime hospitals, carrying with them a gentleness shaped by what they had received when they expected cruelty. Others became teachers, standing before classrooms and choosing their words carefully when they spoke about authority, obedience, and responsibility. They did not preach. They asked questions. They taught their students, and later their children, to pause when a voice claimed absolute certainty, to notice when fear was being used to simplify the world, to remember that enemies were still people, even when governments insisted otherwise. In kitchens and living rooms, they told their grandchildren stories that did not fit neatly into victory or defeat. Stories about American soldiers who ran into fire without thinking twice. Stories about hot water and clean towels and a meal eaten in silence because words had failed. The children listened, puzzled at first. These stories did not sound like the war they learned about in school. There were no grand speeches in them, no flags raised over ruins. Just hands held out, and people choosing not to look away. As the years passed, some of those grandchildren traveled. They studied abroad. They visited the United States. They stood in museums and read plaques about World War II. And sometimes, quietly, they felt something tighten in their chests. Not grief, not guilt, but gratitude. They thought of a moment that had occurred before they were born, in a forest they had never seen, when their grandmother's life had balanced between fire and fear. They understood that without that moment, they would not exist. Letters were written. Visits were made. In a few cases, hands that had once belonged to rescuers shook hands with the children of the rescued, decades removed from smoke and uniforms. Words were often unnecessary. The meaning traveled easily across accents and generations. Thank you was enough. For Americans, these stories surfaced only occasionally. A passing mention in a local paper, a quiet anecdote shared at a reunion. Most of the men who had done the rescuing never thought of themselves as anything special. They did not frame their actions as moral lessons. They had simply acted. They had been raised in a country that believed rules mattered even when no one was watching. That dignity did not end at the enemy's uniform. That power carried obligation. That belief was not written into law alone. It was lived, and it was remembered, not in monuments or medals, but in lives shaped quietly by a moment of unexpected mercy. History often measures wars by territory gained or lost, by the size of armies and the scale of destruction. It remembers victories that can be counted. But some of the most lasting consequences of war cannot be measured that way. They live in the questions a teacher encourages her students to ask, in the hesitation before repeating a rumor, in the refusal to accept easy hatred. They live in the knowledge that an enemy once chose humanity when cruelty would have been simpler. For the women, the rescue never faded into abstraction. It remained immediate, personal, as real as the heat on their skin and the hands that pulled them free. It shaped how they understood responsibility, not as blind loyalty, but as moral choice. They had been prepared to die for a lie. Instead, they lived long enough to see it exposed, and they lived long enough to pass on what they learned. For Americans, the legacy is quieter but no less important. It is the reminder that the nation's greatest strength was never only its factories or its armies. It was the decision, repeated thousands of times by ordinary people, not to surrender decency in moments of power. America's greatest weapon was not bombs. It was the refusal to stop being human. Some rescues end when the fire is out. Others last for generations. This was one of them.